Chapter 20. It was late February, and we were just over a month into the spring semester. I sat at the table going over fourth grade arithmetic papers while the children were out at recess. The older children could be heard playing ragball behind the church. In front, a group of smaller boys were shooting marbles, and several girls were jumping rope beside the church. I could hear the rope hitting the ground and the rhythmic hand clapping and singing. The marble game was barely audible, but the ragball players behind the church were loud and clear, and it took all my concentration to go on with my work. The children had been outside about 10 minutes when I felt that one of them had come back inside and was standing down the aisle in front of me. I finished correcting the paper before looking up. Farrell Jarrow stood in front of the table with his hat in his hand. "Mr. Farrell," I said, standing quickly. He looked very small and very sad. He had come to tell me something, but he didn't know how to say it. "Didn't mean to barge in," he said. "I was just sitting here," I said, trying to put him at ease. He looked at me and batted his eyes a few times. "Is something the matter, Mr. Farrell?" "They want you up there," he said. He wanted me to read more into what he had said than he had told me. "At the front?" I asked him. He nodded. He wanted me to read more into his nod. I waited for him to go on. "That boy," he fidgeted with his hat. He didn't want to say any more. I waited. "They done set the date," he said, but not wanting to say it. "They want you and Mose up there. They want y'all to tell her." "When?" "Right now, I reckon. I still have another hour of class." "I just take they message, Professor." He lowered his eyes and fidgeted with his hat again. "Thank you, Mr. Farrell." He nodded and started up the aisle, stoop-shouldered and very small. I saw him put on his hat as he went down the steps into the yard. When he came out into the road, he looked up the quarter toward the big house, but instead of going back to work, he turned left and went home. I followed him to the door, and now I went outside to tell the children that recess was over. They formed a double line, boys in one line and girls in the other, according to grades and sizes. After they had come in and sat down, I gave them assignments and told them I had to go up to the big house and that I was leaving Irene in charge. If anybody caused any trouble, I would deal with that tomorrow. I asked Irene to walk with me to the door, and I told her to dismiss the children at 3 o'clock. I didn't tell her why I had to go to the house. The sky was overcast, and there was a chill in the air. Grinding was over, and the people had begun to chop up the ground for new planting. Flocks of birds followed the tractors, searching in the fresh, uncovered earth for insects and worms. The plum tree in the Coles front yard and the cherry tree in the Freeman's side yard were covered with blossoms, white and lavender. The pecan trees were bare, gray and leafless, but the live oaks and magnolias were full of leaves. The road was fairly dry, but the ditches on either side still held water from the heavy rain we had had during the past couple of months. When I came up to Henry Pichot's house, I saw Reverend Ambrose's black Ford parked under the tree in the backyard. Inez opened the kitchen door when I knocked. The preacher sat at the table drinking coffee. Inez asked me if I wanted a cup of coffee, but I said no. She left the kitchen. Reverend Ambrose asked me about my aunt. He had seen her at church only a few days before, but he didn't know what else to talk to me about. I told him she was all right. He wanted to know about school, and I said that everything was going pretty well there, too. We were quiet then, because he could not think of anything else to say to me, and I had nothing to say to him. Inez came back into the kitchen and told us that Henry Pichot had called the sheriff and that the sheriff would be here in 15 to 20 minutes. "I hope this is not one of those days," I said. "I thought he was already here." "You sure I can't get you a cup of coffee?" Inez offered again. "No thanks," I said. "I have a lot of work to do at school. I hope I don't have to hang around here all day." "I'm sure he's on his way," Inez said. Reverend Ambrose, who sat very close to the table, raised his coffee cup to his mouth, then returned it to the saucer quietly. As promised, the sheriff was knocking on the front door about 15 minutes later. His knock was not a request for entry. It was an announcement that he was already coming in. Inez sighed deeply, thanking God, and went to the front door of the house. I heard the sheriff asking her if we were there, and a moment later she came back into the kitchen. "They want y'all in the front," she said. This is the first time I had been in any part of the Pichot's house other than the kitchen, and I was sure that it was the first time for the minister as well. I waited for him to move first, but he was waiting on me. I made a respectful gesture for him to precede me, but he would not move, was afraid to move, until Inez took the lead. Henry Pichot and the sheriff stood by the fireplace talking. Pichot wore a brown and tan plaid jacket, a tan vest, and an open-collar shirt and dark trousers. Sheriff Guidry wore a gray suit, a string tie, and black cowboy boots. He held his cowboy hat against his leg. He and Pichot looked at us as we came into the room. I had never seen Pichot look so worried. "Have a seat," he said. "The sheriff has something to say." All the furniture in the room was old. Faded, overstuffed chairs, an old, overstuffed love seat, an overstuffed couch, and a rattan rocker with a pillow. The lamp tables were old, and the lamps and lampshades looked just as old. Reverend Ambrose and I sat on the edge of the couch. The sheriff sat in one of the chairs and held on to his hat, so I figured that what he had to say was not going to take very long. Henry Pichot stood at the fireplace, his back against the mantel. Behind him, a couple of smoldering logs sent a thin stream of gray smoke and an occasional spark up the chimney. "The warrant came down from the governor today," Guidry spoke hesitantly. "It happened second Friday after Easter." Inez came into the room with 2 cups of coffee and a silver tray. Pichot added sugar and milk to 1 cup and removed it from the tray. The sheriff rested his hat on his knee as he took the other cup from the tray. He added sugar, stirring slowly. "I want things to go on as they have. Don't cause trouble for him," the sheriff looked at me. "When I left, he was calm. He seemed to understand. I want to keep it that way. Any questions?" Reverend Ambrose and I exchanged glances, but neither of us had a question now. "What about her?" Guidry asked. "The wife said she might need a doctor." "That's mighty kindly," Reverend Ambrose said. "Many thanks to Miss Emma." "I'll send Dr. Guillory when I get back to town," the sheriff said. "Any other questions? I want us to have an understanding." "Why that date?" I asked. Guidry drank from his cup and looked over the rim at me. He did not like me. I was one of the smart ones. He and Pichot exchanged glances. I could tell that they had been talking about it before Reverend Ambrose and I came into the room. Pichot left the explanation up to the sheriff. "Easter," he said. He did not want to go on, but he felt he should. After all, a man was going to be put to death. It had to be before or after Easter. It couldn't happen during Lent. I would learn later from the young deputy that the governor had originally signed the execution order to be carried out 2 weeks before Ash Wednesday, but one of his aides pointed out that another execution was scheduled during that time, and because of our state's heavily Catholic population, it might not go well to have 2 executions just before the beginning of Lent. "Can we still visit him like we've been doing?" I asked. "Sure," the sheriff said. "But just remember, keep it down. I don't want you aggravating him. He's got just over a month, April 8th. April 8th, I said to no one. April 8th. Friday, April 8th, between noon and 3, the sheriff said. Between noon and 3, I said to no one. "Well, if there ain't no more questions, I'll have to get on back to town," Guidry said. He finished his coffee and set the cup on the saucer on a lamp table. "You won't forget the doctor, Sheriff?" Reverend Ambrose asked. "You think she'll need him?" "She ain't been too well lately," the Reverend said. "I'll call him from here," Guidry said. "Can he drive down the quarter?" "It's passable," Pichot said. "I went down there yesterday." The sheriff went to the telephone table and made his call to the Bion. I could hear only part of what he was saying because I could only hear part of what he was saying because I could not get that date and time out of my mind. How do people come up with a date and time to take a life of another man? Who made them God? "Audrey, let me speak to Sid," Guidry was saying over the telephone. 12 white men say a black man must die, and another white man sets the date and time without consulting one black person. Justice? "The old woman," the sheriff was saying to the doctor. "I think she is the one who attended the trial, worked for the family." "His Nanan," Reverend Ambrose said weakly. The sheriff did not hear the minister. "Yes, it's passable, Sid. You won't get your brown and white shoes dirty. They sentence you to death because you were at the wrong place at the wrong time, with no proof that you had anything at all to do with the crime, other than being there when it happened. Yet 6 months later, they come and unlock your cage and tell you, we, us, white folks all, have decided it's time for you to die because this is the convenient date and time." "Oh, she's all right. And how is Lucy?" the sheriff asked the doctor about his wife. "And on Friday, too. Always on Friday. Same time as he died, between 12 and 3. But they can't take this one's life too soon after the recognition of his death because it might upset the sensitive few. It can happen less than 2 weeks later, though, because even the sensitive few will have forgotten about their savior's death by then." "Give Lucy my love," Guidry said. "I owe you one." The sheriff hung up the telephone and turned to us. "He's on his way, and I have to head on back myself. No other questions?" We had no more questions. "Thank you all for coming," Pichot said. But he was not thanking us for gracing his home with our presence so much as he was telling us that it was time to leave. Reverend Ambrose and I got up from the couch and went back into the kitchen. Inez looked at us, crying. "We must all show courage for Sister Emma's sake," Reverend Ambrose said to her. Inez raised the end of her apron and wiped her eyes. "You drove?" Reverend Ambrose asked me. "I walked." "Well, you can ride back down the quarter with me," he said. "I'm not going back down there right now," I said. I'm not going back down there to tell her he's going to die April 8th. Not me." "You'd have the strength if you had God," Reverend Ambrose said. "That's where you come in, Reverend," I said. "I'm going for a walk, a long walk in the opposite direction. Excuse me." I went across the backyard out to the road, and I turned left and walked over the highway and down to the river. The river still ran high from all the rain we had had the past couple of months, and from the water that drained into it from the bayous and fields. I walked in the ankle-high grass, safe distance from where the water flowed up on the bank, until I found a good place to stop. I could see the houses and trees on the other bank, and the cars moving on the road behind them. I tried wiping that away. I wanted to see nothing but miles and miles of clear blue water, and then the island where I could be alone. Or Vivian and me, just the two of us, and absolutely no one else. No one else. But the river remained the same, high and muddy, and I started walking again. When I could go no farther without getting my feet wet, I went up to the bank and walked alongside the road. I must have gone for 3 or 4 miles before turning back. I figured by now the minister and my aunt had seen Miss Emma, and the doctor had probably visited her, and other women in the quarter had gone to look after her too. It was near dark when I reached the quarter, and I went back to the church to get my satchel. Irene had collected all the papers and stacked them neatly on the table, and had left me a note saying that the children had been orderly. I stuffed the note and the papers inside my satchel and left the church.